Right.
Teaching.
So they know you're coming. They know you're coming.
They know we're coming. Yeah.
Yeah. And have you had any more streamers than you had?
We get. I haven't checked how many streamed last year, but there's always a few streamers live, and then more people who watch the thing after the events.
Yeah. That's good. Sorry, Chris.
No, don't worry at all.
Unfortunately, the owners weren't there because there were only 14-year-old kids there, so she wasn't going to photograph it. She had to do it from the gate. They had these owners have been there, they'd probably gone down inside as well. I was longing to see where I used to live as a kid. But my mother had said, oh, they've probably knocked down and built flats on it, which kind of upset me for some reason. And in fact, it's still there.
No.
An old seafood shop.
That doesn't surprise me.
No, which John really can't make it.
I'm surprised John hasn't tried to stream it though. Hiya, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So I've hit-
Would you like some notes? I've got some notes.
Oh, if you
yeah.
have, it would be very nice, yes.
I've hit stream, Anne, so it's currently.
Oh, okay.
I'm nearly
Have we
quite
checked
into
the
that,
angle
don't
of
I?
the... you got the notes?
John said that I was in the middle,
Okay,
so we're trusting
We
John.
hope, yes.
that's fine.
Oh, I can work that out.
Yeah,
Well,
he can.
Great.
I'll put it here for the moment, darling.
So you can always quickly flick and see if you think that's.
Yeah.
So
Yep, that's good.
good. Good. So we
Well, getting so professional, we ought to nearly to have a clapper board.
yeah.
And a man shouting 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bang. Take
I'll shut the door. They don't seem to be having a
No bridge tonight.
bridge, yeah, do they?
I think they do that once a month.
Good for you.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah.
In Lent.
We're the most regular here. We've had the film club, and we've had the bridge club, but they just seem to do a few weeks at a time.
Oh yes, they put these old films on, don't they?
Mm.
Well, they put old ones on.
squatters' rights then.
Yeah,
Well, it works very well, this room.
it does.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, anyway.
Yeah, that's what I think is excellent.
No, particularly now we can stream, and streaming-wise, we're actually hardwired streaming, which is even better. So you don't get any
Interference
or anything.
Yeah, brilliant.
Well, try I eat this biscuit quickly and then we're supposed to If anyone's watching a holding screen, they can hear me talking and eating a biscuit.
Was that came up then?
New updates for your programmes are available. Avast. Is that
So that's what you call it, you know,
virus?
virus, antivirus, so ignore those things.
Do you wish you could understand things like that, darling?
Don't wish you could understand it. I think you just want to work, you don't want to have to.
No. Could do so much.
Good, well, shall we can always assume, but it's before 7:30.
Right, if that's right. Is it 27 minutes, 28?
I haven't
Go
got.
by the phone.
I don't think that clock's quite right, but that may be my...
Oh, it says 17:28. It says on.
Yeah, I'd go for that.
That's interesting. My notification only came up 3 minutes ago. But it's been streaming for a while, hasn't it? But the notification from YouTube
Oh, that it started. It's just-
only just about 3 minutes.
Yeah. So that's one of the things we've learned in doing it, is that the stream is always not quite live. But I guess what that means is that they can guarantee that it keeps going.
Yeah.
You can just buffer it up.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I was going to say we've nearly doubled last week's numbers. It's me, Anne and John. But you know, kind of talk to John as if he was a whole big audience. So.
Yes. They wouldn't know, would they, the people?
No. And John tried to ask intelligent questions as if he was you, Howard. So. He actually made comments and I'll try.
All right. And the Rackstraws online.
Nice, good, yeah.
So you can say hello to him in a minute.
Has he sent you a note to tell you that, or are you?
Yeah, he just sent me a note.
Oh, I see.
Because I guess actually with the WhatsApp group, if, you know, people could in theory send questions in, couldn't they? So
I could.
Yeah.
good. So is Mavis with Andrew? We don't know.
Don't know. Or it says it's us online.
Yeah,
so.
so it probably is.
Yeah.
So hi Andrew and Mavis. Oh,
Oh,
except we're not
not
filming
yet.
at the moment.
Oh, you can
Matt
say
will
it when-
hear. Yeah. I'll say it when we all come together.
Oh, we've turned 7:30 now.
Okay,
Hang
so
on,
should we?
hang on, let me just get you up. Okay, you're live.
Good, and welcome Andrew and Mavis, because we've just heard from you. So good. Well, let's pray, give our evening to the Lord, and yeah. Well, see, I was going to say, see where we get to. In theory, I know where we're getting to because I've done PowerPoint slides for it, so I know how far we're going and no further. So, Father, we just thank you for the time we've got, and thank you just for the conversations we always have. It is actually one of those things. It becomes a pleasure to see people. We just kind of gather for this bit of time together each week, Lord Jesus, and just encourage us, bless us as we share you and think about you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So, in terms of just pure PowerPoint slides, I've got slightly less this week. There are two reasons for that. One is we're actually only looking at 6 verses. Because we're doing Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, obviously those that mourn. And we kind of highlighted the way in which the different of the Beatitudes kind of are unpacked in different verses. And we've only got 6 verses, but there's a kind of a sense in which there is a flow between the Beatitudes we've been looking at. So in theory, you could kind of start this week. We could have started it a few verses back, but actually similarly, the few verses back also fitted with previous week, last week's. So it's just the way it kind of falls. So we've only got 6 verses we're going to look at, and then the other side was that actually I sadly have to confess to having to do a drive tech course today, for obviously caught speeding. So that's my confession. So I had to, and I thought it was going to be on Friday, but it was Thursday, which meant of course I realised I didn't have time to do as many slides today as I did going on there, but. But no, I won't make any comments in case I incriminate myself. Best say nothing else. There's nothing else, but there you go. So those that mourn. The thing I always remember, it was one of those strange things that there are probably, if we remember back to when we first kind of started to follow Jesus, and you start to read the Bible or listen to Bible stories or teaching with more detail, and I always remember this concept of those who mourn being explained, that actually mourning in Scripture is not purely to do with someone's died and I feel upset about it and how do I express that. It's much more like a kind of slightly broader, sober attitude, but it has got a focus on the fact that people die, because that's part of the reason why life has a sober element to it. So actually being alive is a fantastic thing, worth celebrating, joy, and so on. But actually our mortality does bring a sort of soberness in and brings a perspective. And that the reality of that perspective is not all negative. Judith often says it to me is in terms of approach to certain things and the way I kind of am toward. And she often says, well, you mustn't forget that obviously you were confronted with your own mortality when you're 15, and I know on a personal level that did have an impact on the way you see the world, the way. So in actual fact, there are certain things that don't massively stress me. And Judith says probably because when you've been told you've only got 3 months to live, it puts everything else into kind of perspective, and that is true. Almost everybody that goes through a disaster or something that forces them to think about their own mortality, strangely, and the funny thing is now I'm saying it now as we prepare this, that's just given me another psychological thing we could have looked at tonight, which I hadn't actually put in, which is that actually sometimes the pain of facing of injuries and near-death experiences and so on, actually the people often come through it with a greater propensity for being happy than they had before it. And that's just one of those weird kind of things. I think we touched on this over the last few weeks, but that statistically you're more likely to be happy a year after an accident that leaves you paralysed than you are likely to be happy a year after you've won the lottery. And that doesn't make any kind of it is totally counterintuitive. It doesn't make any logical sense. But it's purely simply that something about the tragedy kind of forces a re-evaluation and a different approach to happiness, which we are going to think a little bit about tonight. In a way that if you just go through an amazing experience, you have it, but our ability to experience, if you like, the joy of the moment is actually limited, which is sensible, because otherwise one great big win, like a lottery win, and everything else is pointless. And the sad thing is that to a degree that is what happens. If you're only looking for happiness from the things that happen to you, then actually as things start to get smaller, you start to get depressed, which is why we are actually made in a way where we generate our own happiness by having the right attitude, which is a very biblical thing, if I can put it that way. But most people don't learn how to do that, and I'm not saying this in a trivial way to say, hey, we've all got it right, but to a degree we learn how to do that because we're forced to do it. If you give anyone here in the room the choice, would you rather win the lottery tomorrow or got hit by a car and left in a wheelchair? And there is nobody, being honest, who would say I'd rather be hit by the car. See, so we don't naturally choose the things that actually give us the skills that enable us sometimes to find those things. Anyway, it's not really the point of this evening, but it was just the thing I was perhaps drawing out was that mourning was about taking a sensible, sober kind of attitude. And that was one of those moments I always remember. That was a surprise to me. I thought, oh, okay. But it highlights something that's useful to kind of take on board, which is there is a place to which understanding a biblical worldview is an important part of our kind of learning experience. I'm a great believer in the Spirit being able to speak through the fact that we come to Scripture totally ignorant of a biblical worldview. I read something, I misread it, but the Spirit still speaks to me, and somehow my heart is in the right place, trying to engage with the Lord through the Bible. I totally get it wrong, but somehow the Spirit still speaks, and I get led by it. I'm a very big believer in that, so I really want to say that. But when we're talking about, if you like, the building blocks of a wider community, it's important to try and really work them through, and to kind of have knowledge within the group and so on that we can share and have some confidence in. And one of the important things in that is to understand that very often that a biblical word has come to us through several different routes. So there might be a Hebrew word which got shaped when the Bible was first being translated, although they tried to work direct from Hebrew. The Hebrew lexicons weren't as well developed as they are nowadays. So your Wycliffes and the others were also bringing a kind of spirit-led creativity to the mix, but they were using words from their own culture. John Wycliffe was, of course, inventing words like the atonement. So they were kind of putting those words together. And now, over time, a word like wrath, for instance, conveys something to us which it may not have conveyed exactly the same to the original listeners. So the reason I use that word is that in English there's a very specific focus to wrath. In other words, that particular black spot is what makes me angry. So the focus is the black spot. Whereas the Hebrew word is it's a kind of agitated, shaken up, I feel I'm disturbed inside type of word, if that makes sense. So it's less focused. So God's wrath is not so much he saw you having a cigarette behind the bike shed when you were 15 and he's wrathful against that. But actually there's something about the world as it is that disturbs him, if you can say that in a way that doesn't make God seem small, but you get what I'm saying. And so I think it's important to understand that mourning has this wider kind of sensible, considered, sober kind of consequence to the world. And to kind of get a feeling for it, one of the things that I think is quite nice just to kind of spot is when we think Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, because they'll be comforted," is that Isaiah himself actually kind of makes it a kind of a quality or something that the Messiah is going to bring. So I put there, Jesus came, according to the Messiah was going to come to comfort those who mourn, to appoint those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland of ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, a garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness and the planting of Yahweh. So there is a kind of a messianic fulfillment to this idea. So it's not just, oh, well, you're a bit upset and the Lord will come and put a hand around you and comfort you, but there's something that is to do with the Messiah who's going to bring some sort of dynamic that actually brings new levels of hope to the world, because we're going to see hope becomes the kind of part of the comfort of mourning and so on. And so there's an obvious kind of Old Testament context here, and then there's wider. We find that the idea is quite common through the Old Testament. Psalm 30 now is actually by David as a song. It's treated as a song of dedication for the temple. Of course, David himself never saw the temple, but he's written the psalm, and you read the psalm. It's not about the temple, but it was used in dedicating the temple. So we read. I'm going to go right the way through Psalm 30 because you're going to see the whole psalm in one sense, and it's a psalm of David, who is, if you like, the prototype Messiah. He's part of what the Messiah brings because he turns the miserable into the happy. He transforms the way that the world is being seen. And so he says. So I'll read through. I'll extol you, Yahweh, because you have raised me up. So there's a sense of raised up. That's comfort. And have not made my foes rejoice over me. Yahweh my God, I cried out to you. So there's a sense of someone being desperate. And you healed me again. This idea of low to high. It goes on. You brought up my soul from Sheol. And you've kept me alive that I shouldn't go down to the pit. And those words we often see in a prophetic sense for Jesus. That he hasn't abandoned his soul to Sheol. He's actually kept Jesus alive. But this is, if you like, part of the way in which David acts as a prototype for Jesus in these words. Sing praises to Yahweh, you saints, give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, but his favour is for a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning. So we've got the same contrast again. Gone through the tough times, but here comes the joy. And as for me, I said in my prosperity, so when everything was going well for me, so when things were easy, I shall never be moved. And you, Yahweh, when you favour me, you made my mountain stand strong. But when you hid your face, I was troubled. And I always love the honesty of Scripture. So David is just saying, it was easy when everything was going well. I felt rock solid, a bit like Peter. They might all abandon you, but I never will, Lord. I'm rock solid when it's all going well. But then you hid your face from me. I lost that sense of your presence. I couldn't feel you. Because actually Jesus goes through this experience on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's a sense of it's not that God has forsaken him, but he has lost, if you like, his feeling of God's presence. So you can lose the feeling of God's presence, even though we read biblically, we know he's with us. But actually we can lose the feeling of it. And it seems that part of the cross experience for Jesus is he loses that feeling. And in that context, as David puts it, I was troubled. And I cried to you, Yahweh, and I made supplication. And what profit? And then I love David's logic. So what profit is there if I die, if I go to the pit? Because the dust's not going to praise you. Is it going to declare your truth? So hear Yahweh and have mercy on me, because you're my helper. So there's a kind of place of faith that you'll be the one who encourages me, lifts me up. You've turned my mourning into dancing. Some of these we know them because we sing them, don't we? But I just wanted to see this kind of contrast. This is part of the experience both of the Messiah, and so the Messiah both brings it, because we saw that in Isaiah, but actually David is a prototype of the Messiah, and it actually becomes a sort of a psalm that we recognise and see in Jesus because of the not abandoning me to the pit. Actually we see even the Messiah going through this experience of that kind of sense of loss, and but the return to joy. And you clothe me with gladness, and we think about those words in Hebrews about he's anointed with joy above his fellows, again quoting from the Psalms, that is part of the experience that Jesus goes through. So where am I? To that end my heart may sing praise to you and not be silent. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you forever. So that's that whole of that kind of psalm, which becomes, if you like, the dedication of the temple, which becomes the physical presence of God with us. And although David never actually sees it, he's left the psalm, which is about his own journey from everything was good, then it felt really low, but now I'm here again. And we get this kind of contrast of mourning and rejoicing, and so on. You find it again in Solomon. So I can start in verse 1, Ecclesiastes. I put it there that the wisdom of Solomon. Are you okay? Sorry. Yeah, okay. That Ecclesiastes probably isn't written by Solomon, but it embodies his wisdom. It's the way it's written. It talks about kings before in the plural, whereas obviously there's only one king in Jerusalem before Solomon. So it's probably a way in which, if you like, a slightly down the line has captured some of wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon. But in that context, chapter 7, it starts with a good name is better than fine perfume. So we've got to leave that hanging for a second. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. So now we're beginning again to hit the issue of mourning, because mourning does happen because the world is a sad place and people do die. But he makes the strange point, and he contrasts it with this strange statement that having a good name is better than fine perfume. And we always think of names in many ways as something that the parent purely gives the child. But actually, of course, through the Old Testament, you find which is actually common in loads and loads of cultures, not just which is actually the name that someone gets known by the end of their life can be very different, because the name should reflect something of their own experience. And so, if you like, there is a faith element to the name in the sense of the name has been acquired by what's gone on. And so he starts. So Solomon's wisdom is a good name is better than fine perfume. You really want to have achieved something. Something in your life ought to make a statement about who you are, who your identity is. And therefore the day of death is better than the day of one's birth, because that's, if you like, this is the final reckoning, can't go any more. But when you were first born, you'd done absolutely zero. Now, we've grown up in a context of the Protestant Reformation, so we all know we're not saved by works and so on. But this isn't necessarily talking about salvation, it's talking about the productivity of life. And that actually we are made to be productive. I've touched on this so many times, that in Akkadian, which predates the first earliest Semitic language, Adam comes from a word that means to make or to produce. There is something about when God has made mankind that we are supposed to be productive. We are supposed to be producers more than we are consumers. And Solomon is driving at that. It's better to have a good name. It's better to be known. You produce something, and that's how people know who you are. So Abraham, we all know as Abraham, the father of many, and Jacob, which means crooked or deceiver or manipulator. We don't know him as Jacob. We know him as Israel, which is God's prince, or along those lines. You see, so the good name is the name that you achieve as you go through life. And actually that thing that you're known for at the end is kind of better than, if you like, the open opportunity before you've achieved anything at the beginning. So there's a kind of a sense in it which I always like. This is an old Greek proverb. It says, a society grows great when old men plant trees under whose shade they know they'll never sit. And it apparently was one of those statements, one of those proverbs that Capability Brown used to really like. And I always thought it's a kind of a really nice example in that sense of the way in which obviously he was landscaping gardens which would not come into, if you like, the full fruition of how good they were until after he'd died. And so there is a kind of a sense in this verse, as we're going to go back to Solomon in a second, I'm going to suggest that part of what he's driving at, just kind of give the context to, it's wrong way. There we go, back again. Oh, I keep going the wrong button. There we go, yeah. That actually there's something about the way we plan that actually can even kind of go beyond our... it's almost like Solomon saw something that the Greeks then picked up on, that there's something actually about planning for beyond yourself and seeing life beyond just the immediate moments of your everyday existence. Because everyday existence, as Jesus said, is full of what shall I eat, where should I go, is the sun shining or is it not? and it can become very much a kind of, if you like, that momentary passing pleasure. Is life comfortable or is it not? As opposed to, is it meaningful and has it got context and has it left something, has it produced something? And so there's a kind of a sense in which you find it in Solomon's thinking. So the Ecclesiastes goes on, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. because that is the end of all men, and the living should take this to heart. And in that kind of context, that actually it's important that we have an attitude that is shaped by, if you like, an understanding and knowledge of our own mortality. That actually affects the quality of the way we do things. It affects the quality of the life we plan for and the way we work. And during the week, I was meeting with somebody up at the EA, who goes out to lots of churches. He said one of the things I'm regularly now trying to do with churches is getting them to think for much longer term. To think, because he said a lot of the churches he's going to, they're kind of more new churches and so on. So it's often where their life is. He said, but the difference is, unlike say a Catholic church that used to have plans for 100 years in the future, they don't have those plans because it's all about the immediate. And I'm trying to get them to think longer term about their longer term legacies. And actually, I think when he was saying it, I think actually it's a very biblical thing. We hear it in Hebrews, when it talks about those who by faith lived for things that they didn't see accomplished, but now they see being fulfilled in us, and how the great crowd of witnesses is kind of cheering on because they see the fruit of that. And so you have a very kind of clear example. We got them here in Solomon. You have it into the New Testament. There's something about the way we do life by faith that sees the impact of our life beyond its natural mortal experience. And there used to be a genuine philosophy out there. I can't remember which is the whole issue of I think the way that kind of stood behind it and wrote books on it. It went through a popularity thing in the late 70s, which was that you should aim to kind of basically suck up every moment that you can, and your last check should bounce, and there should be nothing else left in the in other words, don't forget what your kids are about. It's your life. You only get one of it. You ought to live it as much as you can. It's all about consume, and of course then that gives birth to the approach that we have now in the modern world, which is we define someone by how much they consume. You have a really big nice car, you have a really big nice house. That's actually consumption. It's what I drag to myself, as opposed to production, which is what I generate, which others can also live from, and so on. And so that was very narrow. So of course, the moment you're dead, your legacy is unimportant because you don't know anything about it. It's kind of the logic. So Solomon, better to go to the house of mourning because everyone's going to end there. You should take this to heart. And as I say, I know, and particularly it's not just obviously my own experience, but as you sit down with people pastorally, when you do take it to heart, it changes the way you plan for life. It changes the way you think about life and you look at it. So sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of the face the heart is made good. Well, that's a really fascinating little statement. Man is made for adversity, as the sparks fly upwards. It's also in Ecclesiastes. And it's interesting. I haven't got slides on this because I said I didn't have as much time to pack them with every slide I could think of as going along. But there's been research being done which actually would indicate that when you look at well-being theory, that it's impossible to have well-being without having had to overcome a few problems. Which I think, again, it always makes me smile because, Revelation, we all know that the heroes are the overcomers. And you can't be an overcomer unless you've had something to overcome. So there is actually but it also changes if in one sense very slightly. It can modify. It should shape our theological perspective because very often our prayer is we want to have an easy life, but actually the psychological evidence is that actually an easy life is a very unhappy life. And what we normally mean by an easy life is it's all pleasure and happiness, as we'll think about in a minute. That's not the full story of actually the good life. The good life includes those things, it includes pleasures, it includes happiness, but it's not purely those things. And very often those other things actually are things that aren't quite so pleasurable or aren't quite so happy, making us instantly happy, but they become, if you like, the grit in the oyster that produces the pearls. And so that seems to be a little bit what Solomon's driving at here. That sorrow actually is better than laughter because we all know we're going to pursue happiness. We all know we're going to pursue laughing. We're all going to go for that. So we know we're going to find it, but actually it's often that little bit that actually kind of does the work that's slightly deeper, slightly more complex in it. And it's complex to talk about because people will say, oh, well, you're saying that God sends bad things on people, which is not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I think He's created a world where often whether something is good or bad is a matter, really, in all seriousness, is a matter of perspective. You know, if you, I can remember as a kid, you know, doing a camping holiday with my parents, and they intended to do 7 miles along the coast. You know, it's only 3.5 there to the town, 3.5 back. 7 miles that was. That made me so miserable for the day. This was the worst bit of pain that I could possibly kind of imagine, you know. But actually, you do it, and it kind of feels like, see, I can still remember the fact that we walked 7 miles when I was about 8 or 9, you know, because actually it's an accomplishment, and it kind of produces something. It's not what you're choosing. In other words, God's perspective, and I don't mean this in a trivial way, God's perspective on what's good for us can sometimes feel quite painful. But it's not the same as something that's genuinely bad for you. Is the kind of that way. And so sometimes those things that kind of make you grump along, and but actually they're good for character, good, and it's not just character, that they genuinely are good for your well-being as well. So and the heart of the wise man is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And again, touching on this, that you know that all of the evidence shows that very often the worst thing we do for our children is make life too easy for them. It's often been said that the trouble is that very often parents who have done well spend so long giving their kids the childhood they never had, that they don't give them the advantages of the childhood they did have, what it gave them, if I can put it that way. And so actually sometimes because it's not a total kind of, you know, always this way or always that way, but you will often, you know, it becomes a kind of a regular motif in kind of drama or whatever. It's the person who's had everything going well for them who's actually often the most miserable, destructive kind of personality and character. Is not an unusual thing, and we actually need sometimes, for that sense of meaning, we need bits that have been painful, and there is something about, you see, this context of actually deliberately choosing to go there. And I always remember, it's quite personal once it's Stephen, talking to someone shortly after I'd had the lymphoma and we'd been healed. So that's, praise the Lord, that's fantastic. And you know, people say things like, well, if I had your experience, then I would believe like you do, and so on. And I often think, well, no, you have no idea. I can have exactly the same doubts and wobbles and all those things that everybody else has. But the thing I always remember is I remember talking to someone whose life was now falling apart because something bad had happened. And I remember asking the question genuinely. I said, but you know, you watch the news every night, and you know, we'll see situations from around the world where people who love the Lord and that these bad things are happening to them, but they're not losing their faith. And I don't want to say, it can sound really rude. I'm not wanting to sound that way, because actually I do understand it, because it's about the context we have, if you like, that we don't, what we're used to. But what it feels to me was really important, I figured was in this kind of conversation, I remember coming back and trying to think it through, and I was thinking, is that very often we have a faith because we have had that prosperity, like David says. Remember, we saw it in David. When I was prosperous, everything was fine. When it was all going well. But the truth of the matter is, around the world there are awful things happening all the time, every day. And somebody is having to face that. And it is actually only because I don't stop and think myself into their situation that I don't have to be bothered by it. Does that make sense? So in other words, it's important for Christian maturity that we, if you like, develop an emotionally, theologically consistent approach to suffering that knows the goodness of God despite the suffering, not simply because I don't get any of it, if I can put it that way. And that's quite a deep, nuanced sort of challenge. But I remember thinking, actually, because of having gone through what I went through, you think about those who, and I remember, because it can sound fatalistic, and I'm not at all fatalistic, so I'm very, very cautious about how you say these things. It's just part of why I think the Sermon on the Mount is so powerful, is it's not easy peasy. It's about balance, you know, holding the tensions of these things, that Jesus actually is willing to address these difficult issues, and that I realised, because I remember going through this logic and trying to explain it after the event to a friend of mine, which is that when I thought I was going to die, or when they were saying I was going to die, I was devastated and angry and fearful, and so on. But before I knew I was healed, I'd come to a place of peace with that. As I look back on it and reflected, I realised that actually death, there is a separation in death, and that's painful. But it's a temporary separation. And more than that, death isn't the issue. It's what I feel I'm missing out on in the life I've got, if you like. And yet that's a small thing, in one sense, than the big thing. Now, I don't want to trivialise it because it's small, because for many, they see that as all they've got. So let's not be trivial about it. And actually, there is a wonderful privilege in it. I love the way Bill Johnson put it, which is that we have opportunities in this life we will not have in the next. We actually get the privilege of kind of growth in being able to praise him and know his love for us in the context where we are surrounded by these painful things, and that's an incredible thing. Paul says something similar, about in how his sufferings have actually lead him deeper into Jesus, which obviously once you get to a place where there is no suffering, you don't get that opportunity. Put it that way. And so there is something in that. The house of the wise is in that house of mourning, which is not that you're just miserable the whole time, because actually, as G.K. Chesterton once said, I think a saint without joy is someone to be suspicious of. That actually there is an incredible joy in life, but part of the joy in life is because we understand its real value. Which sometimes to know its real value, we have the counterbalance of actually the limited and contained and beaten effect of death, because as we say, Jesus has beaten the power of death and so on. Because we're conscious of that, it actually enhances. It's the bitter flavour that somehow brings out the sweetness even better. So that it doesn't become a sickly sweetness; it becomes actually a vibrant sort of thing. And whereas actually, if you just try and live purely for pleasure, obviously, actually life gets very sad, it gets very lonely. So Paul picks it up, and part of the reason I've got a lot of verses here at the beginning is to show it goes right the way through Scripture. It's part of the prophetic context for Jesus, it's part of the wisdom context of the Old Testament. So there in the mouth of Jesus, mourning, comforted. And the way Paul puts it, for godly sorrow works repentance towards salvation, which brings no regrets. But the sorrow of the world works death. So there are different types there can be. You can be miserable, you can mourn in ways that have faith, and in ways that don't. And if it is godly sorrow, it actually leads to salvation. And I again, it's an emotional statement, but hopefully you'll say, I understand what you're saying. But I look at so as I say, I was talking to David Landrum for the EA this week, talking about who runs their advocacy perspective of things. And I was just saying, I look at what's going on, and I do work with students, and you do other things with young people, and I wouldn't like to be a teenager today. That's one of the things I'd say, because it's quite tough. I think I genuinely mean that, But actually, genuinely, I grieve for kids who are growing up in the world that we're growing up in, who at one level have every technological privilege you can imagine, but have been born into a world view that is so devoid of hope or point or purpose that very, very quickly people get very jaded and cynical as to what their lives are about, which is why you see, not rocket science, why you see increasing numbers of depression in young people, self-harming and suicide and so on. And if it was like one or two and everybody was fine, then it's probably their problem and you can deal with them one at a time. When it's the majority, I can put it that way, then you have a systemic problem. I know it's a bit sounds like a bit of a trivial way of putting it, but a few years back, you looked at the statistics, and 95 people when they got to retirement age didn't have the money to be able to retire on. And now, it didn't mean they didn't have anything, but so therefore 95 people were either living below what they really wanted to, or they were continuing to work. Now, if it would been 10%, you'd have said, well, they got it wrong, they played badly. When it was 95%, you realise the system is wrong, and actually that's what the government did. They realised actually the whole way that financial services worked and whatever was geared to do much, much better. Now, they haven't got it perfectly worked, they haven't got it right yet, but actually part of the logic for trying to address things, and so they brought in things like fixed fees for consulting and for financial advice and so on. And all of those things were partly because they realised that the systems just weren't working for the average person. And once you've got that kind of level, and I think in a similar way, there is something about the way we do education, the kind of the culture that we allow that goes on and so on. And it's such a kind of a cloud of culture is such a cloud of different aspects that you pick on one thing and people go, oh, you're making a big fuss about nothing, But it's not the one little thing; it's the whole big kind of cloud of what becomes the culture and the air that people are breathing. That is just not a happy place for them. I can't remember why I was saying all of those things. Oh yes, it was this context of, and in that context, I often use the word I grieve sometimes for the kids who are growing up in this culture. Put it that way. But actually, this is a grief, and it really is. I kind of feel really pained for it. That the remarkable thing with the gospel is people get saved out of all sorts of situations, but the majority of people pick up a worldview based on the culture they grow up in. So, if you take, say, some of the work that Howard does, it's these remarkable things out in India. But actually, for an average kid who's born into an Indian village as a Hindu, it's an effort to kind of get out of that, unless something breaks in, if I can put it that way. You just absorb what you're in, if I can put it that way, when you're a child, because you're trusting of your parents, you're open to being filled, your head gets filled with whatever the bits are that kind of come in. So this is going off tack a little bit, but what I'm saying is, I suppose the thing I wanted to get across is, I look at that, I don't get angry, don't get mad, I actually grieve, if I can put it that way. I don't even think my generation has been a total failure. I think you can make some of that. We can make that argument, but the trouble is that's often about blaming other people or whatever. We have to live under the grace that we have. But actually to look at things and you can say, actually they are not right, but I'm not saying this with a wagging finger. I'm actually saying it's not right, and that's painful. And that's what I think about is what Paul's driving at here. You have a godly sorrow, and somehow it leads you into the hope of salvation. And it's that thing of actually, but the Lord is still good, and actually He still works, and actually He is an antidote. And sometimes I look at your circumstances, and I was asked this week to make contact with someone doing it in the next couple of weeks, who's in a very low place emotionally, but is suddenly that low place has brought him around to where he's asking spiritual questions. So saying, "Oh, can you go and chat with them?" So obviously, that actually there is hope in this situation. So there is a sorrow that can actually lead to somewhere positive, as the way Paul puts it. It doesn't have any regrets, but there's also a sorrow, which the world works, which actually brings death, which you think there's no point to this. I'm going to bail out quickly, if you see what I mean. And now that's part of the tragedy, which is why we grieve over it. And so I kind of, as I was thinking, really there is something here, which is about how do you measure life and how do you pursue life in this simple concept of those who mourn, but they will be comforted. That actually there's something about mourning which is actually good, if I can put it that way. There's something about this sober understanding which can seem to have pain to it, that actually is worth embracing because it's part of something bigger. And I go back, which at this slide, because I found that it's so useful over the years, working with non-Christians, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I touched on this earlier, how in one of the earlier sessions, how the physiological and safety needs, those kind of things, and up to kind of pushing up into love. Very often, when we're having those needs met, we experience it as pleasure. It's a pleasurable life. To use the words that Aristotle used, it's hedonic happiness. Happiness that's about pleasure. And as we kind of move up and we're looking at life and the things we're accomplishing and so on, then it becomes more the eudaimonic happiness. But at the top level, which in many ways that top level, as Maslow writes about it, is something you can't really do until you're right towards the end of your life. So it is kind of in the house of mourning. It's not. You can't do it when you're a teenager. Just if you're pretending that you're all about achieving your potential and self-actualization when you're only 20, you're kidding yourself. You're your frontal cortex hasn't fully developed until your late 20s. So until your late 20s, your personality is changing, all sorts of things. And then you have to learn how to really make the skills that you've been given kind of have wisdom to them. So it's only later in life that you can be claimed to be kind of towards that top level. And that's where we find the kind of words, righteousness, well-being, joy, or righteousness, peace, joy, and the Holy Spirit is the way, as we've talked about, that Paul kind of puts it. But in the you will find in secular psychology that people look at this issue of to have lived life the right way morally is for self. You've got to be doing it that way. So that's righteousness. Well-being they use instead of peace. And what's really interesting is well-being theory grew out of happiness theory, but part of the way it grew out of it was by saying happiness is not enough. But actually, if you just look at happiness, you don't get it. You actually get it by pursuing things like meaning and purpose. You're more likely to achieve happiness, and then we've got something bigger than happiness, so we call that well-being. So the definitions of well-being actually go outside of just simply happiness. You have to have these other things. And joy, which I said I've now found described as being a combination of trust and purpose with people, so it needs people again. But all of those things, as I say, they kind of belong to the mature life. They're something you're working towards. They're there as part of, if you like, the life that has been lived well in the Spirit and with the Lord and so on. If you're living it those ways, I think we should more likely we should be seeing it more regularly in the church. If we are deliberately growing into these things, if that makes sense. There'll always be people who find it in other ways because they're human, and that's the way the Lord puts it together. But we're told in Romans 8 that the Spirit effectively intervenes in terms of the inclinations of our spirits. In other words, He's working with us to try and achieve this. So we ought to be seeing this. It's my challenge for the church. The church ought to be seeing more people at that place where they're saying, I have had to live this life well, and I've accomplished it well. But one of the things that's kind of really important to notice in this is there's a kind of there is a place of planning deferred. There's deferred reward or deferred satisfaction, which kind of goes with the different levels of satisfaction you have. So the pleasure you see is instant. So I have pleasure instantly as soon as I eat it or I do whatever, I feel it. Happiness is actually always deferred. It always comes after the event. If you're looking at the eudaimonic happiness, not confusing the two. As I've touched on this before, as we've gone through, you have children. It's quite a pain. They're up in the middle of the night. They're filling their nappies. They're getting kind of measles and crying all day, and you can't go to work. And so there's all kinds of things that are not pleasurable, and they don't necessarily say, you don't necessarily say they're making me really happy today. But you look back on it, you think, I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we have this family. I'm glad we've done this. That kind of. So there's a degree of kind of look back on and so on. And if we're going to get pleasure in those things, we have to take a slightly longer term perspective than pleasure. And joy, I think, is pushing it furthest. And I put in I did a bit of a breakdown of this in the Supernatural Hope book. And told the story of the floods, who went as missionaries. I've probably mentioned those before, if I said anything about. Because I find myself choking up when I tell the story, because it's one of those really moving stories. About how, so they, it's about 1920, they feel called, they're Norwegians, or they're Swedish, feel called to the missions field, and it's back in the days, people were just getting up and going. It's in the early days of the Pentecostal movement. So in all their enthusiasm, they got off and head off to the Congo, and they trek out hundreds of miles. They're the only Westerners there. They get rejected by the village they feel the Lord's telling them to go to, but they allow them to live outside the village, and they send this little lad out day by day with them to sell them eggs and goat meat and things like that. And so the husband got a bit low about this, but the wife kind of kept her spirits up, and so she used to take the opportunity and share Bible stories and talk to the little boy English as he'd come up and tell him the stories. And then she got pregnant. So they already had a child, David, and then she got pregnant, and they were hundreds of miles away from the station. So she had the child. There was another couple who'd come out with them, but they then left because they couldn't cope with it. So she had the baby in the bush, and she had a bleed problem after, and so actually, barring the miracle, she was bleeding to death. And her husband was quite distraught in the context, and she named the child Anya, and then she died. You see, and she knew she was going to die when she named the child. But she stayed positive all the way through. And the husband took the child, his existing son who's 6, and the baby back 100 miles to the thing. He was so depressed, he left with the boy and left the child there at the. And an American couple who were missionaries at the thing took Anya back, and they renamed her Agatha, and she grew up during the 50s into the 50s in the US. She married a pastor. He was at seminary, and one day someone put a magazine, a Swedish magazine, in her inbox. They never knew who. And she picked it up. She didn't speak Swedish because she's, so it's a long story, but let's go. She picked up the magazine, opened the thing, and there's a little cross with her mother's name on it. She knew her mother's name, Svea Flood. And so she was shocked, but she couldn't read any of it. It's in Swedish. So she took it to the seminary and found a Swedish speaker there. And it was an article by a guy who's leading the largest indigenous denomination there in the Congo, who has a little lad in his village used to take food out to the missionaries who weren't allowed in, and who had given his life to Jesus. And he knew a handful of Bible stories. He'd let me talk to read by her, and how she'd had a child and she'd died. This is her grave. But he'd gone back and shared his stories with his peers and led them to the Lord. And so gradually a denomination grew up that were now following Jesus. And it kind of grew and it grew and grew. And so it made her start questions about obviously her whole route, because it's a remarkable story. So they decided to go back to Sweden and try and track her father down. So when they're travelling through London, there was a conference going on, a mission conference, and they decided to go to it. And the platform speaker was the guy who wrote the article. So they got to meet him, and he actually said, "Well, you need to come out to see, the legacy of your mother." And so they went. So they went. Because I don't think she didn't find her father initially, but then they went out, and people lined the streets and went through his honour. There are tens of thousands of believers. I mean, she eventually, cut long story short, she did re-find her father, who'd lost his faith totally. He wouldn't allow the children to mention the name Jesus in the household, and she shared the story. He breaks down in tears, as you can imagine, and was restored with the Lord and died a few days later. But the thing I always got, as I made the point in the book, is that Svea's last words were, "Call her Anya," which was Swedish for joy. Call her joy, if you like. And there's a kind of sense in which the picture really captures something about life is not just for what we get in it now, but actually is what we've left behind, the imprint that is there. And it feels to me it very clearly kind of ties in with those verses that we read in Hebrews, that the great crowd of witnesses, and they're having their reward in us. That actually, so we have this very biblical kind of understanding. And I often say it, think of it this way: if you think about Abraham with the promises he has from the Lord, is you'll be a great nation, all the nations of the world will be blessed in you, you'll have your own country, and he dies. When he dies, he has water rights to a well and a graveyard plot, and one kid. Well, no, Ishmael as well, but you know what I mean. That's the one. It's kind of really, it's not that big, and yet over 2/3 of the world belong to Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even Jainism and other things where Abraham plays a role. Actually the whole world knows who he is, and he really has been a blessing to the whole world. But that he wasn't going to see that for 2,000 years. The perspective is actually way beyond the immediate grave, if you sort of mean. And so there's something about actually owning that with faith that means that we live to a different standard, if I put it that way. But part of it is about this defer. We need to therefore learn, if you like, to defer and make bigger choices rather than the instant pleasurable ones. So just as if you're going to achieve happiness, there are times when actually it requires us to learn to forgo pleasure. Actually, if we're going to live that kind of well-being life has come together, there'll be times where actually it doesn't even necessarily make us that happy to do what we have to do. You know, just being really blunt. But actually well-being is bigger than happiness theory. Happiness theory wasn't enough when it was studied. It proved to actually be that if you pursued happiness, you didn't tend to get it. You actually had to go for something bigger than that, which sometimes didn't make you happy while you were pursuing it. But when you look back, you're more likely to have achieved something in that area. So in the kind of that whole well-being theory, there's a kind of sense in which, if you go back one, see positive emotions and engagement, they're very often about the pleasures of life. Engagement I tie in with hope, as I think we touched on a couple of weeks ago. But we kind of, it's very much driven by certain hormones that feel good as we're involved and we have the right positive emotions, we feel good about things. But actually it's often in the relationships, the meaning, the accomplishment is where we're kind of hitting that sort of those things that are going to outlast us and build something further afield. And obviously there's a really well-known kind of experiment in this whole area, the marshmallow test, the Stanford marshmallow test, which if I throw it out, probably people have heard of it, you know, which goes back to an experiment done in Stanford. They didn't really realise what they were going to discover. When you put children in a room with a marshmallow and say, but you're just going out for a bit, if you can leave the marshmallow, then when they come back, you get 2. And children they never make it 15 minutes, but they were measuring how long did the kids take, you see. And the funny thing was, it wasn't well planned, and therefore often you'll hear it criticised because it wasn't really a well planned thing, but because it was measuring something different at the time. But because the town that the guy who did it from, he drew all the kids from the same school that his kids went to. And as they went through school and then high school, he started to notice, because he would ask about how so-and-so's doing, and so-and-so. He started to notice a correlation between the kids, the kids that were doing better and were the ones that lasted the longest in terms of being able to resist the marshmallow. And famously kind of actually established this kind of very important principle that actually is now being extrapolated from the individual and is looked at in a much, much bigger sense, which is actually for society to come together, to create cultures that do better for everybody, requires a higher level of individuals who have learnt to defer the pleasure now. So we in other words, we deliberately live in that looking for the happiness or the joy, if I can put it that way. We start to take a worldview, going back to that old men planting trees under whose shade they won't sit, that actually that is all tied up. And the funny thing is, if you go and look online, you know that although it's not presented as a Christian argument, but the very Jungian psychologist Jordan Peterson keeps on coming back to the fact that Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of sacrifice now for something bigger later, and that the reason that the Western culture has been so successful is because the thing that it puts highest, if you like, the thing that it makes God, in his kind of Jungian language, the thing that they aspired to was a model that can be emulated, which ultimately sacrifices itself for something eternal, you see. And you don't get bigger than making a sacrifice now for something eternal. And because we've made that because that was, if you like, the pinnacle of Christian as a culture, Christian culture, that has been good for the West, you see. And so his argument with atheists that want to put it down is, even if you're right, you're just destroying what's made the thing good in the first place. I can put it that way. So there's something in that sense deeply Christian about this issue of deferred benefit, which actually increasingly we're finding is just becoming a mainstay of psychology. Is actually we have to learn to live with that sense of I sacrifice now, even I sacrifice in my own life for the bigger thing. If civilization doesn't emerge unless you have old men planting trees under whose shade they won't sit, almost. So if we only live for the now, then our civilization starts going downhill. So that's becoming a sort of just a standard recognised fact. The problem you have is if you don't have the Christian gospel, how do you encourage people to live for something beyond their own lifetime? How do you say to them that's a better philosophy than the one that was going around in the late 70s, which is that you should aim to write your last check on with your dying breath and it should bounce after you've gone. Why is that? Why isn't that as good? Why shouldn't you live that way? You put it that way. Why go for that bigger thing? So there is putting those kind of those mix in. So that's a very long way of introducing a single verse, really. But I think is tied up biblically in that concept that Jesus picks up when he picks up the best of those who mourn because they will be comforted. And you look at and that's why I wanted to spell out some of the passages from the Old Testament so you can actually see the tension of it. It's about planning and thinking beyond ourselves, and Paul picks it up and shows it in the New Testament. But then Jesus goes on, and he then also kind of picks up this issue, therefore, of it within the context of mourning. Because part of the Jewish understanding of mourning is we mourn over sin. We mourn over the consequences and the brokenness. Not sin because it hurt me, but sin just because it's messing things up. So it's very easy to be judgmental because people hurt us. But those who really care about these things, and so, if I can put it this way, is, sorry, I'm about to sound really crude, but sometimes I do. It's just for the. But on one level, it really doesn't bother me. How people get their. How people kind of rub each other up to kind of stimulate their own genitals. Sorry, it doesn't bother me, except that it's such a powerful force. It messes up and breaks down society when we don't put any restraints or controls on it. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, I remember we used to talk to mums at the school gate when I was leading the church. It's funny because I was one of only 2 dads that used to drop their kids off, so that's why I was always talking to mums. And they often used to make kind of like jokes, say, "Oh, do you see such?" And they go, "Oh, of course, haha, you wouldn't understand that, would you?" I'm thinking, you have no idea. You have no idea the kind of pastoral things that you deal with people, and what you really do understand about. We're not kind of some sort of shocked, blinded sort of kind of community that don't understand.
We're Victorian.
Yeah, I know. It's just weird. It's just funny, and I didn't try and disavow them. I kind of go, well, you might be surprised. Might be surprised at some of the things you have to deal with. Sorry, I'm not going to say anything because it's not fair but in one sense there is. So it's not a question of, oh dear, I'm outraged, if I can put it that way. It is actually that it's just damaging. It's damaging to people. There's nothing finger wagging in saying that when a father abdicates his responsibility and leaves a mother bringing up a child of his own. We can talk as much as we like about the courageous mum and how much she's doing and so on, but the reality is that almost every measure of level of well-being going forwards, you see a single mother can work hard on 1 or 2 elements, but she can't work on all of them. And so the reality is there will be impairments to the development potential. Now, of course, there are other things. You can have 2 abusive parents or bad family or whatever. So it's not just saying that's the only thing, but you're just saying. We're just creating a problem because we can't actually hold these things together. So this is about mourning, as I say. But actually, then Jesus gets into this. But as he comes in, don't judge lest you be judged, because actually mourning is not the same as judgment. Does that make sense? Actually, the best way if we're going to fix this is not to stand there finger pointing. We have to actually kind of get into a place of getting involvement. Which is not the same as condoning at all. It's not condoning, but it's not the kind of self-righteousness of standing back, saying if you'd done it my way, we'd have been all okay. But unfortunately, you did it your way, and we did go for the judgment thing. And he makes this statement: so whatever judgment you judge, you will be judged, and whatever measure you measure, it will be measured to you. Which is actually the challenge of what has sometimes been referred to. I'll throw the word in now. It's meta-hypocrisy. We'll unpack that in a minute. Which is often that kind of judging without, it's that thing as we miss the fact that we're judging people for the same things we do.
Just a question.
Yeah.
I always thought of judging as condemnation, because a judge issues a sentence, he condemns.
That's right. What's the difference?
So I always think if do not condemn other people, you too will be condemned. So that I find that has a better way of understanding that, because the function of a judge is to issue the sentence.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
That's right.
The jury finds guilty, the judge has to pronounce.
Yeah. Well, so I put the question. There's a clear difference between judging and discerning or whatever, because actually, you could say what Jesus says, you hypocrite. So he's judging in that sense, and part of the problem is, we understand that we use a lot of words which are quite broad in terms of the construct of what they cover, and we have to interpret out of that their context, and we know what the context is when we're in a real live conversation, but very often when we read a report, we're out of the context and we give it its broadest meaning. So there's clearly a difference between judging, because actually Jesus says, in the way that you judge, so you'll be judged. So there's a kind of a sense in which we have to bring some level of what you might call discernment or assessment to the situation. But what he's therefore driving at is much more that sense in which we become, we allow this now. We go beyond our job. It's like you're saying. It's like the jury that wants to now also do the well, actually in the States they do, don't they? They can set damages. We want to become. We don't just want to be on the jury. We also want to be the judge in this kind of context. But there is something, as I say, in which remember, the Sermon on the Mount is delivered to those that want to go up the mountain with Jesus. So there is something we have to turn on ourselves and ask the question of ourselves in how we are allowing. Are we mourning over sin? Are we feeling the brokenness of the world? But then are we just standing back kind of with the finger pointing, if you like? Or does it actually, how do we change it? How do we actually make something better? And so he goes on, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but you don't consider the beam in your own eye? So there's something about mourning which is taking sin seriously. That's part of the Hebrew Jewish concept of it, is that it's not kind of, hey, well, I didn't get caught. It's actually, no, there's something wrong here. And you hear it in Paul's writing, when he talks Romans 7, the good that I would do, I don't. But he does finish, the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus set us free from. There's something to set us free from that way of thinking, but there's a kind of a genuine pain in it, and that you miss the beam in your own eye. So I put it up here: meta hypocrisy. And there's something that I think as you take this on board, it becomes a challenge to it, and that's part of the same challenge that we looked at with Jesus, which is Jesus says don't judge, because in the same way you judge, but Jesus does say, well, you hypocrites, you doing it like this. So there is a place to call out what's true, but that's not the same as, if you like, standing away from, if you like. The good news is, not that I think it is, when I was going out to a meeting the other day, and Julie said, "Can you please go and have a shower and change your shirt? You smell." So she'll be really pleased I told everyone that. Because actually, there's a relationship. You can say the truth, and there's a context for truth. Whereas actually, if we'd waited, we got there, and then she just spent the whole evening, "You really smell," then that would just be unkind. But you get what I'm driving at, So you're kind of, we're doing something in a way that is actually looking to lift and change, or is it actually just keep people locked up in that place? And so meta hypocrisy, I kind of threw a few I was trying to think of some examples. So I threw a few statements. Some of these are genuine. I actually heard things like this being said over the years, but I draw the line between good people like me who don't judge and bad people who put others in boxes. There's can you see we see the kind of the irony of that statement. There's no greater hypocrisy. This is a quote from a psychologist. There's no greater hypocrisy than meta hypocrisy. Hypocrisy about your own hypocrisy. But we use things like that all the time. I've got a few more. It's rude to interrupt, she interjected. I think it's not all about you. I've actually heard that one. I think it's not all about you. Share that with me, you greedy pig. That's And this one, I remember it on a news report. It was on a genuine news report, and there was a thing going on, and the commentator kind of said something about the Germans, and the German who was responded said, we Germans don't use racial stereotypes like you English do, which just made me laugh out loud watching the television, and nobody seemed to notice it. That was the thing. They just continued with the kind of conversation. So there is something also in this, because Jesus says, in the same measure will be applied to you, that actually we've taken the broader mourning, but as he talks about that, so mourning means that actually we wanted to change things, we don't just want to judge it, But actually in our judgment, just to be aware that there is something in a judgment process, which is that actually we are hardwired to kind of measure by the standards we do see are important. So in actual fact, if I'm saying the person's crossed the line that they shouldn't have crossed, is because I actually know that that's a line that shouldn't be crossed, if I can put it that way. You know, we all have, where I do this sometimes when we're talking, I'm doing this with secular context, is to say, you know, the thing is we all know each other by our actions, but we know ourselves by our motives. See, so if you ever notice, people will actually judge each other. They will express what their motives were, but they will actually judge someone because of what they did. If that makes sense. So you know, I'm terrible at this. You know, I think nice things to people, but I don't necessarily say it to them. You see. So you know, Judy pointed out to me some years back. It's very useful having a very honest partner, isn't it? She said, you know, you didn't say anything to those people walking past when they were walking the dogs. And I said, no, I'm sure I smiled at them. She said, no, you didn't do anything. And I thought, well, in my head I was saying hi, but I didn't actually say anything. So I'm thinking, so actually from a judgment point of view, they probably thought, what miserable old so-and-so he was. We said hello, and in my spirit smiled at them. But that we do that. We kind of, therefore we have a different measure for ourselves because we know our motives. We know that I don't feel ill towards you, but I didn't actually do anything to get that across. But I might look at you, I might see the person who cuts me up on the road and get angry with it, because I don't notice the time when I do it. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't doing it deliberately against you, because we know that wasn't our motive. So we have that thing, and it's a really important challenge in the way we do things. So here's one. So in our house, OMG is oh my goodness, I so hate attention grabbers. Hit like if you agree. Those little kind of moments. So the question is, if you're looking genuinely to work with people in a way that's to lift them. So in other words, and this is really relevant. Sorry, I said it's really relevant. I think it's really relevant because the world we're in at the moment is doing an awful lot of finger pointing across political divides, over social issue divides. They're doing a lot of whatever, and people don't change because somebody the other side of the fence shouts at them. It's just they don't. You know, you don't. And actually, that's one of the things that has been shown. Is that once you go into an emotionally defensive mode, your brain is not actually putting new position things in place. It's all one way. So in other words, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, to learn something new, you have to have your mind has to be open. You know, so children. That's why children are so easy to teach rubbish to, because their minds are open. But to have your mind an open mind, you often need to feel secure. You need to be comfortable with the people you're with, and there needs to be something kind of playful about the exploration. So kind of learning in a playful environment, you're more likely to take on new ideas, things that challenge you, because of the kind of the surrounding safety. Once you get into kind of the name shouting, you actually, all of that shuts right down. So now what happens is you have the most brilliantly conclusive logical argument that has ever been given by mankind, and it comes straight at your head. And it goes straight in a bucket of things that people who believe, who make me feel scared, if I can put it that way. And you are inoculating the person against the argument you've just given them. So in other words, if we shove an argument at someone in the wrong way, we are actually inoculating them against the logic that is beautifully laid out in that line of whatever.
I never do that.
Yeah, but it's very difficult, isn't it, when you're really annoyed with someone? But actually it does. So the whole chain gets stored together, but it's now become a label which makes me feel insecure, and therefore it just gets harder and harder for that message. So then we have to find new ways in, you know. So how do you actually kind of highlight moral failure without being a hypocrite, and if you're not perfect yourself? In other words, how do you do it in a way that's not just you stand there pointing the finger, even though you know there's a bit looks true of you. So I got this term from this guy Jeremy Sherman. It's just a standard site PhD, but right, he did an article in Psychology Today, and he points out, you know, one of the things that's very good in therapy is what they refer to as mirroring. You know, so as a genuine thing, if you're in a you know, you're meeting someone with different faith or different perspective on something, one of the things that's very good to keep conversation at a good level is what they refer to as mirroring. So you ask the person to kind of explain their situation. When someone does, when we're in a combative mood, the thing that's rising in us is we're often listening to what they're saying, working out how we're going to counter it. So we're not really listening, we're preparing, we're using what they're saying to prepare our counter. So actually by mirroring, it forces you to stop and listen, and then you try and repeat back to them. So I understand it this way, this is how you'd see it, and so on. And that's a very good way of keeping dialogue both civil and actually productive, because it helps you see a different perspective and so on, and you find the places you can agree on. But he used this little phrase. He said actually one of the things he finds more effective is what he refers to me erroring instead of mirroring, which is that once you're kind of in that place where you've put the person's situation back, you now try to identify them with them, which may not be exactly the same, and it's not an excuse. It's not like saying all the time it's always my fault, but what you're trying to do is saying, yes, I understand this, and I will tell you my story that kind of shows, if you like, me making the same mistake. And because actually it becomes a very good empathy point, and what you're giving them is more of a journey than a position, which is actually, I can understand you in this position because it's something that's a bit like that for me. So when I was actually preparing these slides yesterday, I can't remember where I was on the train going up to, that's right, I was meeting in London yesterday. I went up and I tried to look something up on Amazon. In fact, I looked up to see if this guy had written any books, which he has, Ghost in the Machine. And I went on Amazon and I got this message. Uh-oh, something went wrong at our end. Which is nice, but actually it's not true. What went wrong is that I wasn't connected to the internet, which is why it wouldn't work. So actually it was all my fault. It wasn't their fault at all. But they're working on this basis that, yeah, let's assume there's something that's nice about that. But there's something more than that, because it's not just taking the blame for something that's not your fault. When he talks about me erroring, is that actually you're pushing yourself, you're helping to find a place, whereas I've understood why it is you see the world the way you do, and this is how, but actually this is something in my own story, this is how I see it like that, but actually this is sometimes the limit, and you're giving a kind of much more of a potential journey out, which actually in one sense, by making yourself vulnerable, means you're more likely to be heard. By giving a story that kind of shows a change of perspective, you might leave something with someone that actually makes them think about changing perspective, but without actually you pointing. In other words, they might themselves say, you know what, it'd be better if I could live that way as well. You know, they may not tell you that, but that you're giving them that more readily. And so his conclusion in a strange way is actually, I think, to do something which Jesus is driving at here, you know, that because actually Jesus says the same. So he says, you know, you go on, except Jesus said it 2,000 years later and said it earlier and said it in a much more memorable way. You know, don't tell your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye and behold the beam is in your own. You see, this is when you're just, let me tell you why you're wrong. You know, actually first remove the beam from your own eye, then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's. So actually, there is a sense in which actually identifying in ourselves the relevant thing, you know, and actually it's amazing, because I say it's amazing. It sounds like I'm perfect at these things, not at all. It's just that when you do enough over certain things, you get some things right every now and again. But I remember as a youth worker, you know, you'd have kids that you're working with, and their home situations are nothing like what I had to grow up in. So you can't say I'm just the same as you, but you could find something of a similar nature. You see what I mean? But it's amazing how just trying to do it that way somehow seems to work so much better. You know, I might, if I'm being really objective, say sometimes I was removing a speck and they had the log, but I'm not making them feel like it's the other way around. And what Jesus is saying when he says it this way is always treat it that way round. But for you, it's far more important that you sort it out for yourself than you sort it out for them. But if you do, you've actually got a story that actually leads you through this. So actually, I do have stories about people that I really disliked and wanted ill towards, and that the Lord changed my heart attitude on. So actually, when someone has got a totally broken relationship, this is a relevant story. I can tell you about how my heart gets a bit softened and it gets changed and so on. Does that making sense? And so as I say, I quite like the fact that he's got a nice little modern natty phrase, me erroring to match mirroring, which is you're hearing what they're saying, you're listening to it enough that you can repeat it back, but actually then you're trying to identify in yourself something of your own vulnerability in this area, and actually how you've approached it and how you try and manage that thing becomes actually for the person genuinely helpful. Is that making kind of sense? So you can see then clearly. So don't give that which is holy to the dogs, neither throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, I always remember this verse because I remember seeing it, and I think there's two sides to it, because I used to just see it with one meaning, and now I see it with two. And I remember I was doing, when I did the ICTHAS RadNet year, it was called Radical Network Training Year, we all got taken out. We got taken out to a Greek market to do for open air evangelism. I can't remember even what part of London it was, but it was genuinely cartloads of fish and lots of foreign language. Greek. It was actually mainly Greek and Turkish being spoken. I said Greek, so probably a mix of the two. And we were sharing things, and there was a stall holder who would kind of say a lot of cynical things, and everybody wanted to therefore try and really get through. And but he was very aggressive, very angry the whole time, and everyone was kind of cute. And I remember someone who was with us at the time just quietly said in the background, I said, I think we're throwing. It can sound a bit rude. I think you're throwing your pearls before swine. And I remember thinking, actually, I just think you're right on this occasion. Actually, we're not really getting anywhere. Yeah. What Jesus is. So there is a sense in which don't waste your effort. Don't waste what's valuable to you for people who really don't want to know. Put that way. But the flip side, So I was going to say the kind of the two sides is actually when it's not appreciated anyway. I just think we don't make ourselves more popular. I suppose it's the same thing, really. In other words, I don't think we left there and that guy thought, well, they tried really hard. Now, and I know you can say, how can I know? It's true, And I remember, Paul says, Romans 10, you can't say so and so's going up, because that sort of brings Jesus down, because it's his job to say that. And don't say so and so's going down, because that brings that's like that's again you're devaluing the role that Jesus has in this. So you can say, yes, it's true, we shouldn't be the ones totally to judge, but there is an element here at least of just recognizing that actually it sometimes, and because I think Jesus lives by it, I think you see it. I think that Jesus gives what's appropriate to move someone on. He doesn't always give them the whole truth in one go. He gives them what's needed to take their next step forwards. So the rich young ruler, actually, does giving all your money away get you into heaven? No. But is it the right step for this guy? Yes, it is. And so it's what you're doing is you're giving someone something that moves them forwards. And if and there's a kind of a wisdom therefore to kind of exercise, in that process. I suppose all I'm driving at. And then I thought there was one more verse. Oh, well, there isn't. Okay, that's the last one. So we kind of looked at doing those ways. So if we kind of draw together what we've seen in one sense, it seems like a bit of a mix. So there is the challenge to live life with a kind of an eternal perspective, which actually brings some sobriety to it. So we recognise we have a limited time to do something with. That actually means that you tend to live each day with slightly more, urgency is not the right word, because it's not anxious urgency, but it has more moment to it. I love the fact, it's interesting, because everyone remembers, well, I say everyone remembers, if you remember watching the Dead Poets Society. So the thing that everybody remembers from Dead Poets Society is Carpe Diem, seize the day. And I was reading the history of the quote, the full quote, where it comes from, which I think was what's the guy that committed suicide? Well, no, he was executed, but it's very philosophical. He did it. I can't remember his name right now. Sorry, for some reason, Anne, I'm looking at you as if you might suddenly.
I don't think
No.
Socrates or something.
No, he was the Roman one. He's a well-known orator.
Livy or
Can't remember. Anyway, he uses the phrase. But actually, if you look at the way he uses the phrase, because the film gave us the whole thing of, live the moment, live it up while you can. Gather your rosebuds while you may. In other words, which is a kind of a rather poetic way of saying, go out and do what you can while you're still young. If you see what I mean. But actually, seize the day was actually his context was using today fruitfully for what you're going to leave behind tomorrow. If that makes sense. And I think the two things are true. Seizing the day, you have to grab the moment, but the moment you're grabbing is actually also about, because actually in other words, you can't start saving for a pension the year 6 months before you retire. You see, seizing the day is actually doing it now because there's a further consequence. If that makes sense. So I think there's something of that in the whole approach of what does it mean to have a mournful attitude, to think about the fact that I have a certain amount of life, that one day every one of us will die. That's not really the problem. So let's not get too shocked. I will be really sad because of the loss of relationship for a temporary sense. But actually, if the life has been lived well, then actually we know that it's beautiful in its own time. It may be painful and sad, but if they've had that full life and they've lived it well, then it's a kind of a fitting end of month or end of kind of that accounting thing. It's kind of good to now, okay, it's complete. So we kind of have that perspective that actually then makes each day slightly more vital, because actually I've only got so many of these, and yes, I can do this and this, but I want the whole of these things. As Solomon puts it, that actually a good name is better than the sweet perfume. That's a sensory thing. It smells great in the moment. A good name. And how do you get a good name? How does your name? Because your name gets changed by the Lord as you go through life. You were born Simon, but you end as Peter. You were Abraham, but you became Abraham. You were Jacob, but you became Israel. We go through that. And Revelation, that those who have overcome, He has given us a stone in which there's a new name. There's something about actually what have we done with the life we've got, and actually understanding, if you like, the limits of that. It's part of what makes it good. That it actually means that sometimes I have to work harder today for something in the future. So that I have to defer. And actually, as a practice, that seems to be the foundation of good long-term life. And also good long-term civilization. That civilization comes together when people live those sorts of ways. And biblically, we see that actually, that ultimately, that if you're really living by faith, you're saying something for something that you won't see in your lifetime. You'll have to enjoy it as part of the cloud of witnesses that watch that being reaped. And I use that. I say that really seriously because in all seriousness, it's part of the reason why I write stuff. I'm not saying everyone has to write, but for me, those are the most permanent things I will leave behind, other than my kids. I'll leave my kids behind. They will carry my DNA and other things in them. But beyond that, the house we live in will get sold to somebody else. Somebody else will live in it. And the car that you drive will fall to pieces and then get banned because it's illegal to drive cars with petrol in them in how many years' time. All of those things, but these are little bits that, well, maybe by faith you leave it behind, and nobody publishes it, but it sits on a shelf for 30 years. Because I've picked up books like this by people who have long gone and found myself inspired and whatever. So I think, well, this is partly my response in trying to get these things out. And so it becomes part of the quality of life. And so, some days it's a pain to write. That's the reality. But it feels good to know that it's been done. We'll put it those ways. So anyway, that took longer than I thought it would. But does anyone want to ask or say anything before we? Or if you're watching a live stream, you can always text it to Anne.
So we're not quite related, but I just want to share in Ecclesiastes. So I got saved reading Ecclesiastes. I think that was probably the scripture that Doug directed me. But the other day, when praying some things out with the Lord, to do with financing and all this, but a feast is made for laughter, and wine makes life merry. that money is the answer for everything.
Yeah.
I love the immense practicality.
Yeah.
It's actually, you can have all these wonderful things, but you actually need to make them happen.
Yeah.
You need money. Money.
Yeah. No, I have to confess, Ecclesiastes. Well, I was going to say we all have I have multiple favourite passages, but the whole book is I find deeply amusing in a kind because it's a very modern book. The way.
I literally got saved because I was sitting with my Russian friend. There's a Russian engineer, ex-Russian Air Force guy, brought up as a communist atheist.
Yeah.
And having to do philosophy even in the aeronautical college, although it was socialist and Marxist communist philosophy. And I was saying, Kostya, and I just got my first flying job, so everything was began to climax. You worked so hard to get there, and then what's life all about? And I said, life's meaningless. It's everything's meaningless. So I went married, get 2.4 kids.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're born, you pay tax, you die. It's meaningless.
Yeah.
Everything's meaningless. And he stopped. He said, "Oh, have you got the book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes?" And I said, "I don't know." My friend Simon, who got me saved, basically, had given me this book. It sounds like something that ought to be in there. He says, "You read this book. Very, very good book.
Yeah.
Very, very, very good book. You read this book. Read the book." So I went home after about 5 pints of Guinness, grabbed the Bible, opened it up at Ecclesiastes. Oh, it is there.
Yeah.
And I read it, I think, straight through.
Mm-hmm.
And from the soon when I finished the end of it, then I knew where the answer lay, and it was the Lord.
Yeah.
Then I had to just decide whether I was going to give my life to him or not, because I started getting challenged by a whole lot of other things, convicted by a whole lot of other stuff of my sin and the rest of it. But I'll never forget, he said, "Howard, read this book, a very, very good book.
Yeah.
You read this
It
book."
is very good.
And it got me saved. I still love it.
Yeah.
With the practicality, yeah.
I
Feast
know.
is made for laughter, wine makes you merry, but money is the
Used to-
answer for everything. Which you read that to some Christians, they get really bent out of shape like that.
Yeah. No, I know.
It's
But
actually
it
in the
isn't. It's actually.
scripture.
I was going to say, it's exactly right. Which is that under the sun, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
Actually, under heaven, you have
It's
a
a
different
different
option.
matter, but
But under the sun, that is as good as it gets, and that's why I was saying very often that in our kindness to people, we have to meet them where they're at, which is actually, therefore, we do mourn with those who mourn, because actually that's as far as they can see. So we don't, it's wonderful to have a faith, but don't impose and push that. So we shouldn't worry about it. So that's the best.
it's finding that little balance. I mean, don't give a how to use a dog, but the person who's the dog at the moment, in 3 months' time, when something happens, will be receptive.
Receptive, yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean you write them off
Right,
forever.
forever, never know.
It's just that they're in a bad mood that day and they're really fed up with you.
And, yeah, so don't
They
try
tell
and,
you the second word will be off.
yeah,
So rather than
Yeah.
provoke them,
yeah,
we approach them a month or two later with things.
exactly right, yeah. Good. Well, should we say goodbye to folks on the who might be watching the live stream? And Father, we just